The moon hangs heavy over the Iraqi desert tonight. Below its pale glow, beneath meters of sand and centuries of forgetting, lie the ruins of something extraordinary. The first cities, the first laws, the first written words. Here, in the space between two rivers, humanity took its first uncertain steps from scattered villages into something we would recognize as civilization itself. Before we begin, tell me, if you were suddenly teleported back into the world's oldest known civilization, how would you spend your next 24 hours? Would you explore their cities, speak with their priests, or just stand in awe at the dawn of human history? Close your eyes and let yourself drift back. Not centuries, but millennia. 6,000 years, perhaps more. The world you know dissolves. There are no countries here, no nations as you would understand them. No Rome, no Greece, no Egypt in its glory. Those achievements lie impossibly far in the future. This is the beginning of the story, before anyone knew there would even be a story to tell. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers lies quiet in the morning heat. But it is not empty, never empty. Small communities cluster along the riverbanks, their mud brick homes humble but functional. They have been here for generations, these people. They have learned to channel the water, to coax grain from soil that should be too salty, too harsh. They have learned to make pots and weave cloth. They have learned to count their harvests and record their transactions on clay tablets using simple pictures. They do not know it yet, but they are building something that will echo through all of human history. This is Sumer, the oldest known civilization, and tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we will walk together through its entire story. We will watch cities rise from nothing. We will see the invention of writing transform human consciousness. We will meet kings and priests, artisans and slaves, gods and heroes. We will trace the arc of a civilization from its mysterious origins to its ultimate transformation into something else, something that would carry its legacy forward into every civilization that followed. The question of what makes something the oldest civilization is more complex than it might seem. There are older human settlements, to be sure. Jericho, that ancient city in the Jordan Valley, had walls and towers 10,000 years ago. Çatalhöyük in Turkey was a thriving town of perhaps 8,000 people in the 7th millennium before our era. But these were towns, settlements, communities. Civilization, in the sense we use the word, requires something more. Cities, yes, but also writing, complex social hierarchies, monumental architecture, organized religion, specialized labor, art, and literature. By these standards, Sumer stands alone as the first. The Sumerians themselves would tell you a different story about their origins. They believed that civilization did not evolve gradually, but arrived fully formed, a gift from the gods. In their mythology, the god Enki brought the arts of civilization from the sacred city of Eridu, raising it from the marshes and bestowing upon it the me, those mysterious divine decrees that governed everything from kingship to pottery making. Whether the Sumerians invented their civilization or received it from earlier peoples who lived in the region, the Ubaidians perhaps, remains unclear. What is clear is that by around 4000 BCE, something remarkable was happening in southern Mesopotamia. But before we dive into the heights of Sumerian achievement, before we walk through the streets of ancient Uruk or read the cuneiform tablets of Ur, we need to understand the land itself. Geography is destiny, the saying goes, and nowhere is this more true than in Mesopotamia. Everything the Sumerians accomplished, everything they became, was shaped by the two rivers that defined their world and by the challenges those rivers presented. The dawn of civilization. Sumer emerges. The land of Sumer was, in many ways, an unlikely cradle for civilization. The southern plain of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meander toward the Persian Gulf, was flat, marshy, and unpredictable. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile flooded with reassuring regularity each year, depositing rich silt on the fields before receding, the Mesopotamian rivers were capricious. They flooded at irregular times, sometimes gently, sometimes catastrophically. The waters might come when crops were already in the ground, destroying them, or they might fail to come at all, leaving fields parched and barren. Moreover, the land lacked many resources that other early civilizations took for granted. There was no stone for building, no timber for construction or fuel, no metal ore for tools and weapons. The one resource southern Mesopotamia possessed in abundance was clay. Rich, malleable, eternally renewable clay from the riverbeds. From this unpromising material, the Sumerians would build an entire civilization. The earliest settlers in this region, during what archaeologists call the Ubaid period from roughly 5000 to 4000 BCE, were farmers who understood the fundamental challenge of the land. The rivers provided water, but only if you could control them. Too little water and your crops died. Too much and they drowned. The solution was irrigation, channeling water from the rivers through canals to the fields, regulating the flow, draining the excess. This required cooperation on a scale beyond the family or clan. It required villages working together, and eventually cities coordinating the labor of thousands. The oldest known settlement in southern Mesopotamia, Tel el-Uweyli, dates back to these early days. But the transition from these humble beginnings to true urban civilization happened during the Uruk period, roughly 4100 to 2900 BCE. The city of Uruk, located in what is now southern Iraq, about 50 miles northwest of the modern city of Basra, became something unprecedented in human experience. A true city, with walls, temples, palaces, workshops, and tens of thousands of inhabitants. Picture Uruk at its height. Around 3000 BCE, the city stretches for miles, its mud brick walls enclosing an area larger than many cities of the ancient world that would come later. At the center rises the White Temple, perched atop a high platform that lifts it toward the sky. This is not merely a building, but a statement, a declaration that humanity can reach toward the heavens, that the gods can descend to earth, that there is a bridge between the divine and mortal realms. The temple complex covers acres, its courtyards bustling with priests and supplicants, its storerooms filled with grain and oil, its workshops producing everything from pottery to cylinder seals. The population of Uruk at this time may have been between 40 and 80,000 people. To put this in perspective, there was probably no other settlement anywhere in the world that approached even half this size. This was not just a large village or a small town. This was a city in every sense, with all the complexity and dynamism that implies. People lived in neighborhoods, worked in specialized trades, bought and sold in markets, worshipped in temples, obeyed laws, paid taxes. They were no longer peasants scratching out subsistence from the soil. They were urbanites, living in a society that had transcended the limitations of village life and created something entirely new. But how does a city like this emerge? What causes people to abandon their scattered farming villages and cluster together in such unprecedented density? The answer lies in a web of interconnected factors. The irrigation systems required to make agriculture productive in southern Mesopotamia needed coordination and maintenance on a scale that only a centralized authority could provide. Someone had to organize the digging of canals, the building of dikes, the fair distribution of water. This led to the emergence of a priestly class, administrators who managed these systems in the name of the gods. The temples became not just religious centers, but economic hubs. Farmers brought their surplus grain to the temple storehouses. In return, they received protection, access to the irrigation system, and a share of food during lean times. The temples employed scribes to record these transactions, craftsmen to produce goods, builders to maintain structures. A complex economy developed, one that went far beyond simple barter. People specialized. Some made pottery, others wove cloth, still others worked metal or carved stone brought from distant lands. Trade networks extended from Uruk in all directions. The Sumerians needed what their land lacked. They imported timber from the mountains of Lebanon, stone from the highlands to the north and east, copper from Anatolia, precious stones like lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. In exchange, they exported textiles, grain, and manufactured goods. These trade routes brought not just materials but ideas, influences, connections to distant cultures. The city of Eridu, which the Sumerians believed to be the oldest city in the world, the sacred home of their god Enki, shows this evolution clearly. Archaeological excavations have revealed temple upon temple, built one atop the ruins of the last, each generation raising the sacred platform a little higher. The earliest temples were simple single-room structures from the Ubaid period, but over time they grew larger, more elaborate, until by the Uruk period they had become the massive temple complexes that would define Sumerian cities. What drove this religious architecture? The Sumerians believed that the gods literally lived in these temples, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but actually resided there as you might live in your home. The temple was the god's house, and like any house, it needed to be maintained, furnished, and provisioned. The god needed to be fed, dressed, and honored with rituals. This was the priest's job, and it was taken with deadly seriousness. If the god was not properly served, the god might become angry, and an angry god could bring disaster, failed crops, floods, disease, invasion. This belief system, which to modern eyes might seem like superstition, was actually a sophisticated theological and social framework. It provided meaning and structure to life. It explained natural phenomena. It justified the social hierarchy. It created a sense of community and shared purpose. The ziggurat at the center of the city was not just a building, but the axis mundi, the world's center, the point where heaven and earth connected. Everything radiated outward from there. By the late Uruk period, this pattern had been replicated across southern Mesopotamia. Uruk was the largest and most important city, but it was not alone. Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Eridu, each had its own patron deity, its own temple complex, its own territory. These were city-states, independent polities that sometimes cooperated, often competed, occasionally went to war. The Sumerian political landscape was fragmented, a patchwork of rival cities, but they shared a common culture, language, and worldview. They were Sumerians, and they knew themselves to be different from the peoples around them, more civilized, more sophisticated, blessed by the gods. This is the Sumer that emerges into the light of history around 3000 BCE. But we have not yet touched on the achievement that makes this emergence into history possible, the invention that would change human consciousness itself, and without which we would know almost nothing about these ancient people. We turn now to the greatest of all Sumerian innovations, the gift that they gave not just to their own time, but to all the ages that would follow, the art of writing. The Sumerian achievement, cities, writing, and society. Imagine trying to run a complex economy without writing. Imagine the temple at Uruk receiving grain from hundreds of farmers, distributing food to thousands of workers, trading with merchants from distant cities, all without any way to record transactions. It would be impossible. Memory would fail, disputes would be constant, fraud would be unchecked. The urban civilization that was emerging in Sumer absolutely required a system for recording information. The earliest Sumerian writing, dating to somewhere between approximately 3400 and 3200 BCE, based on current archaeological evidence, was not literature or history. It was accounting, small clay tablets about the size of your hand, inscribed with simple pictographs. A picture of a sheep representing sheep, a picture of grain representing grain, along with numbers indicated by different-sized impressions of a reed stylus. These were inventory lists, records of temple storehouses, receipts for taxes paid, or rations distributed. Mundane, practical, essential, but from these humble beginnings emerged something extraordinary. Over the next few centuries, the writing system evolved rapidly. The pictographs became more stylized, less pictorial. Scribes discovered that it was faster to press a reed stylus into soft clay rather than draw pictures, creating wedge-shaped impressions. These wedge shapes, called cuneiform from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, could be combined to represent not just objects, but sounds, syllables, abstract concepts. By around 2600 BCE, when consistent phonetic elements appear in the tablets, Sumerian cuneiform had become a full writing system, capable of expressing anything that could be said in spoken Sumerian. The impact of this invention cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, thoughts could be preserved unchanged across time. A person could speak to the future. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. Laws could be written down and made consistent. History could be recorded. Literature could be composed and transmitted. Writing changed what it meant to be human. The Sumerians themselves seemed to recognize the power of their invention. They believed that writing was a gift from the gods, that the goddess Nisaba, who presided over grain and later over writing itself, had taught humanity this sacred art. Scribes held an exalted position in society, the educated elite who could access and manipulate this mysterious technology. To be a scribe was to have power, influence, and a respected place in the social hierarchy. Sumerian schools, called edubba, or tablet houses, trained young boys in the scribal arts. We know about these schools because the Sumerians themselves wrote about them. One text, a kind of ancient school story, describes a student's typical day. He wakes early, eats breakfast, goes to school where he must write his tablet perfectly or face punishment. The teacher is strict, quick to use the rod for sloppy work or misbehavior, but the rewards for success are great. A trained scribe could secure a position in the temple or palace administration, could earn a good living, could rise in status. The curriculum in these schools was demanding. Students had to memorize thousands of cuneiform signs. For unlike an alphabet with a few dozen letters, cuneiform had hundreds of symbols, many with multiple meanings depending on context. They studied mathematics, for scribes needed to calculate areas, volumes, weights, interest on loans. They learned the forms of official documents, contracts, bills of sale, administrative records. They copied out ancient myths and hymns, both to practice their writing and to absorb their culture's literary heritage. Some of these student practice tablets have survived. We can see the awkward, shaky marks of beginners, the repeated copying of sign lists, the errors marked and corrected by teachers. These artifacts have a poignant immediacy. They remind us that behind the impressive achievements of Sumerian civilization were ordinary people, children struggling to learn, teachers trying to instruct, parents hoping their sons would succeed. But writing served more than practical administrative purposes. It enabled literature, and the Sumerians created some of the earliest and greatest literary works in human history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a legendary king of Uruk and his quest for immortality, is the world's oldest known epic poem. The poem exists in various versions, but its roots lie deep in Sumerian tradition. It deals with themes that remain resonant today: friendship, loss, the fear of death, the search for meaning in a finite existence. When Gilgamesh mourns his friend Enkidu and confronts his own mortality, he speaks across 4,000 years to fundamental human concerns. Other Sumerian literary works include hymns to the gods, lamentations over destroyed cities, myths explaining the origin of the world and of humanity. One particularly famous text is the Eridu Genesis, which describes a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, with one righteous man building a boat to preserve life. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are unmistakable and not coincidental. The biblical flood narrative almost certainly draws on older Mesopotamian traditions, preserved and transmitted through Sumerian and later Babylonian literature. The crown jewel of Sumerian literature may be the works of Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. Living around 2300 BCE, Enheduanna composed hymns to the goddess Inanna that are passionate, personal, and sophisticated. She is the first author in history whose name we know, the first writer to sign her work and express her individual voice. When she describes her devotion to Inanna, her despair at being exiled from her position, her joy at being restored, she creates literature in the fullest sense, art that transcends its immediate context to speak to universal human experience. The society that produced this writing, this literature, was hierarchical and complex. At the top of the social pyramid stood the king, who in the earliest periods was often also the high priest, or at least closely connected to the temple establishment. Below him were the nobility, administrators, military commanders, and wealthy landowners. The scribes, priests, and skilled artisans formed a middle class of sorts, respected and relatively prosperous. Below them were the common people, farmers, labourers, servants. At the bottom were slaves, typically prisoners of war, or people who had sold themselves or their family members into slavery to pay debts. This hierarchy was reflected in every aspect of Sumerian life. The wealthy lived in substantial houses with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard, walls decorated with niches and alcoves, roofs that served as additional living space in hot weather. The poor lived in small, simple dwellings, often just 1 or 2 rooms. Diet varied by class. The rich ate meat, fish, dates, figs, and drank beer brewed from barley. The poor subsisted mainly on barley porridge and bread, vegetables when available, with meat only rarely. Clothing also marked status. Fine linen or wool garments, sometimes dyed with expensive pigments, distinguished the elite. The poor wore simple wool tunics. Both men and women wore jewelry if they could afford it. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings made from precious metals and semi-precious stones. The very wealthy might own jewelry inlaid with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian. Women's roles in Sumerian society were more varied than in many later civilizations. Elite women could own property, conduct business, and hold important religious positions. The high priestesses of major temples wielded considerable power, both spiritual and political. Enheduanna is the most famous example, but she was not unique. Women could be scribes, though this was rare. They could manage estates. They could appear in court and testify. They were not equal to men in rights or opportunities, but neither were they entirely powerless. Marriage was primarily an economic and social arrangement, negotiated between families with contracts specifying the bride price and dowry. Divorce was possible, though divorce initiated by the wife required grounds such as neglect or cruelty, while a man could divorce with less justification. Children were valued, especially sons who would carry on the family name and care for their parents in old age. Infant mortality was high, as in all pre-modern societies, and childhood diseases claimed many before they reached adulthood. The Sumerians invented or developed many technologies that we still use in modified form today. They invented the wheel, probably initially for pottery making and only later adapted for transportation. They developed the potter's wheel into a fast-spinning tool that allowed mass production of high-quality ceramics. They created the first bronze tools and weapons by alloying copper with tin, marking the beginning of the Bronze Age. They invented the plough, allowing farmers to cultivate more land more efficiently. They developed advanced mathematics, including a base 60 number system that gave us our 60-second minute and 60-minute hour. Sumerian cities were marvels of urban planning for their time. Streets followed logical patterns, often running at right angles. Houses were built of mud brick, sun-dried rather than fired to save fuel. The streets were unpaved but drained by channels that carried wastewater and sewage out of the city. Public buildings, especially temples, were constructed on platforms to protect them from flooding and to elevate them symbolically toward the divine realm. The ziggurat, that distinctive Mesopotamian temple form, reached its full expression in Sumerian architecture. These massive stepped pyramids, built of mud brick and faced with fired brick or stone when available, dominated the skyline of every major city. The great ziggurat of Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, still stands in ruined form today, its 3 surviving stages rising more than 60 feet above the desert. Originally, it would have been much taller, perhaps 100 feet or more, topped by a temple dedicated to the moon god Nana. These ziggurats were not just impressive architecture, but theological statements. They represented the primeval mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation. They were artificial mountains in a flat land, reaching up toward heaven while providing a stairway for the gods to descend to earth. Ordinary people did not worship in the ziggurat. Instead, priests performed rituals in the temple at its summit, maintaining the cosmic order by caring for the god who lived there. This brings us to a crucial aspect of Sumerian civilization, one that permeated every aspect of life and thought: religion. To understand the Sumerians, we must understand their gods, for nothing they did made sense outside a religious framework. Gods, temples, and the cosmos, the Sumerian universe, was a place of order wrested from chaos, maintained through constant divine effort and human service. In the beginning, according to Sumerian belief, there was only Nammu, the primeval sea. From her emerged An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess. Their union produced Enlil, the air god, who separated heaven from earth and created the space in which life could exist. Other gods followed, each with their domains and responsibilities, forming a complex pantheon that governed every aspect of existence. At the head of this pantheon stood An, whose name simply means heaven or sky. He was the most senior god, but somewhat remote, presiding over the divine assembly, but leaving the day-to-day management of the universe to other deities. More active was Enlil, whose temple at the city of Nippur made that city the religious center of Sumer even when it lacked political power. Enlil commanded the winds and storms, could bring both life-giving rain and destructive floods, dispensed kingship to mortal rulers, and generally functioned as the executive power of the divine realm. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, was god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic. His temple was at Eridu, the Sumerians' oldest city according to their own traditions. Enki was a trickster god, clever and benevolent, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, protected them from the harsher impulses of other gods, and generally favored mortals. Many myths center on Enki's cleverness, how he outwitted other gods or solved problems through ingenuity rather than force. Among the goddesses, Inanna stood paramount. She was the goddess of love, warfare, and political power, a complex deity who embodied both creation and destruction. Her primary temple was at Uruk, where she was served by a priesthood that included sacred prostitutes of both genders. Inanna's mythology is rich and strange. In one famous myth, she descends to the underworld to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, but is trapped there until her release is negotiated at the cost of her lover Dumuzi, spending half the year in the land of the dead. This myth likely explains the agricultural cycle and the changing seasons. Each major city had its patron deity. Ur belonged to Nana, the moon god. Lagash was protected by Ningirsu, a warrior god. Eridu was Enki's city. Nippur was Enlil's sacred ground. The temple of the patron deity was the largest and most important structure in each city, the economic and religious heart of the community. To serve your city's god was to serve your city itself. The interests of the deity and the city-state were identical. But beyond these great gods, the Sumerian world teemed with lesser deities and spirits. There were gods of specific rivers and canals, gods of particular fields, gods of individual aspects of life like brewing beer or making bricks. There were demons that caused disease, protective spirits that warded off evil, and ghosts of the dead who could trouble the living if not properly remembered and honored. The universe was densely populated with supernatural beings, and humans lived in the midst of this teeming divine presence, always conscious of powers beyond their control. Sumerian religion was transactional. Humans existed to serve the gods, to provide them with food, shelter, and worship. In exchange, the gods protected their cities, ensured good harvests, granted victory in war. If the humans failed in their duties, the gods might punish them. If the gods grew angry, disaster followed. This relationship was formalized in daily rituals performed by priests in the temples. These rituals followed precise patterns that had to be performed exactly. Each morning, the statue of the god was awakened, washed, dressed in fine garments, and offered food and drink. Music was played, hymns were sung, incense was burned. At night, the god was prepared for sleep. On festival days, special ceremonies took place, sometimes including processions where the god's statue was carried through the streets, so the people could see their deity and receive blessing. Ordinary. Sumerians participated in religion through attendance at festivals, through personal prayers at small household shrines, and through offerings at temples. They might commission a votive statue, a small stone figure representing a worshipper in eternal prayer, to be placed in the temple as a perpetual act of devotion. They would consult priests to interpret dreams and omens, seeking to know the will of the gods and avoid divine displeasure. The Sumerians believed in an afterlife, but it was not a cheerful prospect. The land of the dead Ker was a gloomy place beneath the earth where the dead existed as ghosts, drinking dust and eating clay, living in darkness. There was no reward for virtue in the Sumerian afterlife, no punishment for sin beyond what befell you in life. Everyone went to the same cheerless place, nobles and slaves alike. The only hope was to have children who would remember you and make offerings, ensuring that your ghost received food and water. This rather bleak eschatology contrasts sharply with the vibrancy of Sumerian religious life. Despite believing the afterlife offered little to anticipate, they devoted enormous resources to their gods, built magnificent temples, created sublime religious art and literature. The explanation seems to be that religion was about the here and now, about maintaining cosmic order, ensuring good harvests and military success, making sense of a world full of unpredictable dangers. The gods provided meaning, structure, and hope in this life, even if they offered little comfort for what came after. The temple complexes were not just religious centers, but the economic engines of Sumerian civilization. The temples owned vast estates, employed thousands of workers, engaged in trade and money lending. A substantial portion of a city's wealth flowed through the temple. The priests who managed these institutions were among the most powerful people in Sumer, often rivaling or exceeding the political authority of kings. This brings us to a crucial question: who ruled Sumer? The answer is complex and changed over time. In the earliest periods, religious and political authority were not clearly separated. The high priest was often the ruler, making decisions in the name of the god. But gradually, a distinct class of military leaders emerged, men who gained power through martial prowess and used it to establish dynasties. These kings still claimed divine sanction for their rule, often describing themselves as chosen by the gods, but they were recognizably secular leaders, concerned with administration, justice, and warfare. The relationship between temple and palace, between priest and king, would be a continuing theme in Sumerian history, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, always central to how the society functioned. It is to these kings, to the political history of Sumer, that we now turn our attention to see how the city-states competed and cooperated, how they created the first codes of law, how they struggled to maintain independence before being swept up in the world's first empire. Kings, laws, and early government. The Sumerian King List, a document compiled in the early 2nd millennium BCE but drawing on much older traditions, presents a fascinating and frustrating picture of early Sumerian political history. It begins with kingship descending from heaven, a divine institution given to humanity. It lists dynasties of kings who ruled for impossibly long periods before a great flood, then begins again with more plausible reign lengths for kings after the flood. Separating myth from history in this document is nearly impossible for the earliest periods, but by around 2900 BCE, we begin to encounter names and events that can be corroborated through other evidence. The early dynastic period, from roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, saw Sumer organized as a collection of independent city-states, each ruling a territory that included the city itself and surrounding agricultural land and villages. These city-states were rivals, competing for resources, trade routes, and prestige. War between them was common. The wall that surrounded each city was both practical necessity and powerful symbol of its independence. The earliest Sumerian ruler, mentioned in the king list, whose historical existence can be verified through archaeological evidence, is Enmebaragesi of Kish, who ruled around 2600 BCE. His name appears not just in the king list, but in inscriptions contemporary to his reign. He may have been the father of Aga, the king who appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as Gilgamesh's rival. This connection, if accurate, suggests that Gilgamesh himself, that towering figure of Sumerian literature, may have been a real king of Uruk who ruled sometime in the first half of the 3rd millennium BCE, though the legends that accrued around his name bear little relation to whatever historical reality may lie beneath them. Sumerian kingship was not automatically hereditary in the early period. Kings were sometimes chosen by councils of elders, or seized power through military prowess, or succeeded their fathers only if they could command the support of the city's elite. The title of Lugul, meaning great man, was originally a temporary position, a war leader chosen for his military abilities. Over time, it became a permanent office, the king who ruled the city in peace as well as war. These early kings had limited power compared to the later absolute monarchs of Mesopotamian empires. They had to negotiate with powerful priests, wealthy landowners, and councils of citizens. But they were not figureheads. They commanded armies, judged disputes, organized public works, conducted diplomacy, and when possible, enriched their cities through conquest and tribute. One of the most important early kings known from both inscriptions and literature is Gilgamesh of Uruk. The historical Gilgamesh probably ruled in the first half of the 3rd millennium BCE, though we cannot be more specific. The epic that bears his name, composed and recomposed over many centuries, portrays him as a mighty king who built Uruk's massive walls, a man of both heroic virtues and human flaws, whose friendship with Enkidu and quest for immortality explore profound questions about the human condition. Whether any of the specific events in the epic have historical basis is unknown and probably unknowable, but Gilgamesh's reputation endured for thousands of years. His name invoked by later Mesopotamian kings who claimed descent from him or emulation of his greatness. The city-state of Lagash provides some of our best evidence for early Sumerian government because extensive archives have been recovered from that site. In the 24th century BCE, Lagash was ruled by a dynasty that included a reformer known as Urukagina, a figure of tremendous historical importance. Urukagina came to power around 2350 BCE, perhaps by overthrowing his predecessor Lugalanda, and began implementing reforms that addressed corruption and abuse of power. What we call his reforms are known from several cone-shaped clay inscriptions that survive to this day, giving us remarkable insight into both the problems of Sumerian society and attempts to correct them. According to Urukagina's own inscriptions, he found a city where the powerful exploited the weak, where officials extorted bribes, where the wealthy appropriated property from widows and orphans. Priests demanded excessive fees for burials and other services. Tax collectors seized livestock and goods beyond what was owed. The poor had no recourse against these injustices. Urukagina claimed to have restored justice through reform. He reduced fees, limited the power of officials to confiscate property, protected widows and orphans from exploitation, and proclaimed that the strong should not oppress the weak. He even declared an amnesty, releasing prisoners and forgiving debts. These reforms, Whether they constituted a formal law code or a series of administrative proclamations, represent one of the earliest known attempts at social justice legislation in human history. They establish a principle that would echo through subsequent millennia: that a ruler has responsibility to protect the weak from the powerful. That law should constrain arbitrary authority. That justice is not merely the will of the strong, but something higher that even kings must serve. Whether Urukagina successfully implemented all his reforms during his short reign of perhaps 7 or 8 years, we cannot know with certainty. But the fact that he articulated these principles and claimed to act on them marks a crucial moment in human political development. Urukagina's reign ended in defeat. In what ancient sources describe as his 7th year, the neighboring city of Umma, under its ruler Lugalzagesi, conquered Lagash. Urukagina conducted a wide-ranging civic and religious building program, constructing a number of temples and other cultic sites, according to his inscriptions. But the conflict with Umma dominated the later part of his short reign. The victory inscription from Umma describes the conquest in brutal terms. The destruction of Lagash's temples, which was particularly shocking to Sumerian sensibilities, and the devastation of the city. A later lamentation places the blame for this sacrilege on Lugalzagesi, proclaiming that he had sinned against the gods and would bear the consequences. Lugalzagesi went on to conquer much of Sumer, creating a short-lived hegemony based on military power and claiming the title of King of all Sumer. But his triumph would be brief. A new power was rising in the north, in the region of Akkad, and the man who led it would change the political landscape of Mesopotamia forever. But before we turn to the Akkadian conquest, we must discuss another crucial aspect of Sumerian governance: the development of law. The Sumerians created some of the world's earliest known law codes, systematic attempts to establish consistent justice through written rules. These codes were not comprehensive legal systems in the modern sense. Based on what scholars have determined from the surviving examples, they were more like collections of ideal cases and their proper resolutions, providing precedents and principles that judges could apply. The oldest known law code is the Code of Ur-Nammu, which we know from later copies, though it was probably promulgated by that king who ruled Ur around 2112 to 2095 BCE, during the period called the Sumerian Renaissance, when Sumerian culture experienced a final flowering after liberation from foreign rule. We will discuss this period in more detail later, but for now, what matters is that Ur-Nammu's code, even if composed or finalized by his son Shulgi, as some scholars suggest, preserves legal principles that almost certainly go back much earlier. The code includes provisions about murder, robbery, adultery, false accusation, and other crimes and disputes. Punishments typically involved fines paid in silver rather than physical mutilation, showing what appears to have been a relatively measured approach to justice for its time. Another important legal text is the Code of Lipit Ishtar, who ruled the city of Essene around 1930 BCE. Like Ur-Nammu's code, it establishes rules for various situations. What happens if you rent an ox and it dies? If you marry a woman who then bears no children? If someone makes false claims against another? These codes reveal a society with complex property relations, sophisticated commerce, concerns about social order, and fairness. The most famous Mesopotamian law code is the later Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, dating to around 1750 BCE. While this postdates the Sumerian period proper, it draws heavily on earlier Sumerian legal traditions. The famous principle of proportional justice, an eye for an eye, which Hammurabi's code articulates, has roots in Sumerian legal thought. Though Sumerian codes more often prescribed monetary compensation rather than physical punishment. What these legal codes reveal is a society grappling with the challenges of urban life, of property rights, of commercial transactions, of family relations, of crime and punishment. The Sumerians understood that a complex civilization required consistent rules, that justice could not be arbitrary. that even the powerful should be constrained by law. These are principles that modern legal systems still uphold, and they have their roots in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer. Sumerian government also included what we might call bureaucracy, though that word has negative connotations today. The administrative apparatus necessary to run a city-state, maintain irrigation systems, collect taxes, organize military forces, manage temple estates, and conduct diplomacy required numerous officials, scribes, and record keepers. The thousands of administrative tablets recovered from Sumerian sites give us glimpses of this bureaucratic machinery in action. Inventories of goods, records of workers and their rations, accounts of fields and their yields, all meticulously recorded on clay and preserved for millennia. This record-keeping was not mere pedantry, but essential to the functioning of the system. The irrigation agriculture that supported Sumerian civilization required careful management. Fields needed to be surveyed, water rights assigned, maintenance scheduled, disputes resolved. Labor for public works had to be organized, whether the workers were paid employees, conscript laborers, or slaves. Taxes had to be collected fairly based on accurate assessment of assets and production. Without writing and systematic record-keeping, none of this would have been possible. The scribes who maintained these records were, as we have discussed, an educated elite, but they were also servants of the system, their skills employed by temple and palace to maintain social and economic order. In this sense, they were the first professional bureaucrats, using their specialized knowledge to administer a complex society. The tradition they established of literate administrators managing governmental functions would continue through all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations, and indeed extends to modern times. Warfare was a constant feature of Sumerian life. The city-states fought over borders, water rights, trade routes, and prestige. Military technology evolved from simple spears and clubs to more sophisticated weapons. The Sumerians developed bronze spearheads and axes, body armor made of leather reinforced with bronze plates, helmets of copper or bronze. They used chariots, though these early versions were heavy vehicles with solid wheels, more suited to shock effect and prestige than to the rapid maneuver that later, lighter chariots would allow. Military tactics centered on infantry formations. The Sumerian phalanx, with soldiers fighting in close order behind large shields, was an effective formation for both offense and defense. Military success often determined which cities would dominate others, which kings would expand their territories, which dynasties would endure. The constant warfare was economically draining and politically destabilizing, but it also drove innovation and created opportunities for ambitious leaders to rise to power. This brings us to the most ambitious leader of all, the man who would unite the squabbling Sumerian city-states under a single rule for the first time, creating the world's first empire. His name was Sargon, and he came not from one of the ancient Sumerian cities but from Akkad in the north, a region where Semitic-speaking peoples had long lived alongside the Sumerians. His conquest would mark both the culmination of Sumerian civilization and the beginning of its transformation into something new. The Akkadian conquest and the first empire Sargon of Akkad is one of history's most enigmatic figures. We know he lived and ruled, that he conquered an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, that according to the Sumerian king list, he reigned for 56 years. Though contemporary inscriptions document only a handful of specific year names from his actual reign, but details of his life, especially his origins, are wrapped in legend. Later, Mesopotamian tradition portrayed him as a man of humble birth, abandoned as a baby in a reed basket on the river, found and raised by a gardener, rising through ability and ambition to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, then seizing power and establishing his own dynasty. Whether any of this legendary account reflects actual events or merely served to enhance his reputation as a self-made ruler, we cannot determine with confidence. What we do know from inscriptions that appear to be contemporary or near contemporary is that around 2334 BCE, Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown, though it was probably in the region of central Mesopotamia, north of Sumer proper. From this base, he launched a series of military campaigns that would change the political map of the ancient Near East. First, he conquered the Sumerian city-states one by one. Lugal-Zagesi, who had briefly dominated Sumer, was defeated and led away in a neckstock to be displayed at Nippur in humiliation. City after city fell to Sargon's forces: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma. But Sargon did not stop at Sumer. He campaigned north into Syria, west to the Mediterranean coast, east into Elam. Ancient inscriptions boast that his empire extended from the Lower Sea, meaning the Persian Gulf, to the Upper Sea, probably the Mediterranean. He claimed to have led his army into regions where no previous king had gone, to have washed his weapons in the sea, to have received tribute from distant lands. The exact extent of his conquests is debated by historians, but clearly he created something unprecedented: a territorial empire that united diverse peoples and regions under a single ruler. This was not simply the domination of one Sumerian city over others, which had happened before on a smaller scale. This was the absorption of the Sumerian world into a larger political structure ruled from outside. Sargon was not a Sumerian but an Akkadian, a speaker of a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic rather than to Sumerian, which was a language isolate with no known relatives. The Akkadians had long lived in northern Mesopotamia and had absorbed much of Sumerian culture, but they remained culturally and linguistically distinct. Sargon's empire marked the beginning of a new political model: universal kingship, the idea that all the known world should be united under one ruler. Previous Sumerian kings had ruled single cities or at most a small group of cities. Sargon ruled dozens of cities, controlled vast territories, and claimed authority that transcended traditional boundaries. He styled himself King of Kish, a title that carried connotations of overlordship over all Mesopotamia, and King of the Land, suggesting universal dominion. To maintain control over this vast domain, Sargon had to innovate administratively. He could not rule every city directly, but he needed to ensure loyalty and suppress rebellion. His solution was to install Akkadian governors in conquered cities, replacing or supervising the local rulers. He stationed garrisons to maintain order and respond to threats. He required tribute from subject peoples, enriching Akkad and funding further military campaigns. He used his daughters strategically, appointing them as high priestesses in important temples, creating bonds of loyalty and ensuring Akkadian influence in religious institutions. The most famous of these priestly daughters was Enheduanna, whom we mentioned earlier as the world's first known author by name. Sargon appointed her high priestess of Nanna at Ur, one of the most important religious positions in Sumer. Her hymns to Inanna reveal not just literary genius, but also political acumen. By composing in Sumerian rather than Akkadian, by honoring the Sumerian goddess, she helped legitimize Akkadian rule over Sumerian cities. She presented the conquest not as foreign domination, but as a necessary unification blessed by the gods themselves. Sargon's reign was long and, by his own account, glorious. But maintaining an empire proved difficult. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, requiring military campaigns to suppress them. The inscriptions mention that in his old age, Sargon faced a great rebellion when all the lands rose against him. He defeated this rebellion, but it revealed the fragility of his achievement. Unity was maintained by force and by the personal prestige of the conqueror. What would happen when he died? Sargon was succeeded by his son Rimush, around 2279 BCE. Rimush immediately faced revolts across the empire. The Sumerian cities rose in rebellion, as did regions to the east. Rimush spent his short reign, only 9 years, suppressing these revolts with brutal efficiency. Inscriptions record the staggering numbers of enemies killed, though these figures are likely exaggerated. Rimush was ultimately assassinated, possibly by his own courtiers, a fate that befell several Akkadian rulers. His brother Manishtushu succeeded him and continued the pattern of military campaigns to maintain control, but it was Manishtushu's son, Naram-Sin, who would elevate the Akkadian Empire to its height and push the concept of kingship to new extremes. Naram-Sin ruled from approximately 2254 to 2218 BCE, a long and successful reign that saw the empire reach its greatest extent. Naram-Sin was not content with being merely king. He claimed divinity, having himself worshipped as a god during his lifetime. This was unprecedented in Mesopotamian tradition. Kings were chosen by the gods, served the gods, acted as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. But they were not themselves divine. Naram-Sin changed that, at least during his reign. He had his name written with the divine determinative, a symbol used for gods. He built temples to himself. He required subjects to swear oaths by his name as they would by the name of a god. This deification was probably not mere megalomania, though it may have involved ego. It was a political statement, an attempt to provide ideological justification for universal kingship. If the king was divine, his authority transcended ordinary political relationships. Rebellion against him was not merely treason, but sacrilege. The diverse peoples of the empire owed him loyalty not because of any traditional bond, but because he was a god who commanded their worship. Naram-Sin's military achievements were real. He campaigned successfully against threats on all frontiers, defeating the Lullaby in the mountains to the east, campaigning in Syria and Anatolia, suppressing revolts in Sumer. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa and now in the Louvre, depicts him in heroic scale, wearing the horned crown of divinity, trampling his enemies beneath his feet, ascending a mountain toward the sun god who blesses his victory. It is one of the masterpieces of ancient Near Eastern art and a powerful piece of political propaganda. But Naram-Sin's success could not ensure the empire's survival beyond his reign. His son Shah Kali-Shari ruled only 25 years and spent much of that time fighting to hold the empire together against increasingly successful rebellions. The periphery broke away first, then regions closer to the core. By the time of Shah Kali-Shari's death, around 2193 BCE, the Akkadian Empire was collapsing. The reasons for the collapse are complex and debated. Military overextension certainly played a role. The empire had grown so large that maintaining control required constant military campaigns, draining resources and manpower. Subject peoples never fully accepted Akkadian rule and rebelled whenever central authority weakened. Economic problems may have contributed, as the costs of administration and warfare exceeded the benefits of empire. Recent archaeological and climatological evidence suggests that environmental factors may have played a crucial role. There is evidence of severe drought in the region around 2200 BCE, a climate change that reduced agricultural production, disrupted irrigation systems, and possibly forced migrations of pastoral peoples into settled regions. A weakened empire facing economic stress from drought would be vulnerable to both internal rebellion and external invasion. The final blow came from the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Ancient sources portray them as barbarians who overran civilized Mesopotamia, but this is probably exaggerated. More likely, they were one of several groups that took advantage of Akkadian weakness to raid and eventually occupy parts of the empire. Akkad itself was probably destroyed, though since we do not know its exact location, we cannot be certain. The Gutian period, roughly 2193 to 2112 BCE, is often described as a dark age, a time of chaos and decline. Mesopotamian texts written later portray it as a time when the kingship was held by barbarians who did not understand civilization. But this is probably propaganda from those who eventually defeated the Gutians. Archaeological evidence suggests that while central authority broke down, local city-states continued to function. Life went on, even if the grand imperial project had failed. The Gutian period ended when Sumerian cities regained independence and drove out the foreign rulers. This Sumerian revival was led by the city of Uruk, whose king Utuhengal defeated the Gutian king Tirigan around 2112 BCE. Utuhengal's reign was short, but his general Ur-Nammu seized power and established the third dynasty of Ur, beginning what scholars call the Sumerian Renaissance or Neo-Sumerian period. This would be the last hurrah of Sumerian civilization, a final golden age before the language and culture were absorbed into the broader Babylonian tradition that would follow. The Sumerian Renaissance and the liberation from Gutian rule did not immediately restore Sumerian independence across all of Mesopotamia. That achievement belonged to Ur-Nammu, who founded the third dynasty of Ur, usually abbreviated as Ur-Thrur, which would rule much of Mesopotamia from approximately 2112 to 2004 BCE. This century represents a remarkable revival of Sumerian culture and power, a conscious effort to restore the glory of the past while building something new. Ur-Nammu began his career as a military commander, and there are indications he may have initially served under Utuhengal of Uruk, the man who had expelled the Gutians. When Utuhengal died, possibly by drowning under circumstances that remain unclear, Ur-Nammu took power and moved the capital to Ur, his home city. He then set about conquering and unifying the Sumerian city-states, much as Sargon had done 2 centuries earlier. But unlike the Akkadian Empire, which may have been perceived by some as foreign domination, Ur-Nammu's empire presented itself as Sumerian, a restoration of Sumerian values and traditions. Ur-Nammu styled himself as a reformer and builder. He promulgated the law code we discussed earlier, establishing justice and protecting the weak, though some scholars suggest his son Shulgi may have actually composed or completed the code. He undertook massive construction projects, rebuilding and expanding temple complexes across the land. The great ziggurat of Ur, whose ruins still stand, was his creation, or at least was begun during his reign. It rose in 3 stages, built of mud brick with a fired brick facade, its staircases leading up to a temple dedicated to Nana, the moon god who was Ur's patron deity. This ziggurat was not merely a building, but a statement. It declared that Sumerian civilization had returned to glory, that the gods once again blessed the land, that the proper cosmic order had been restored. Other cities received similar treatment. Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash all saw their temples rebuilt or expanded. Ur-Nammu presented himself as the god's chosen agent for restoring what had been damaged or destroyed during the preceding chaotic period. His military campaigns extended Sumerian control over a territory that rivaled the old Akkadian Empire. He campaigned east into Elam, north into Assyria, and established control over the ancient Sumerian heartland. An inscription claims he made the roads safe, protecting merchants and travelers from bandits, ensuring that trade could flourish. This emphasis on justice, order, and prosperity would characterize the entire Ur-the-Three period. Ur-Nammu died in battle around 2095 or 2094 BCE. According to one interpretation of the sources, he may have been fighting against enemies on the eastern frontier, possibly Gutians or other groups. His death was mourned in lamentations that survive to this day, texts that portray his death as a cosmic disaster, the abandonment of the king by the gods despite his righteousness. These lamentations reflect what may have been genuine grief, but also serve purposes of royal propaganda, establishing Ur-Nammu as a martyred hero whose son Shulgi would complete his work. Shulgi, who ruled from approximately 2094 to 2047 BCE, was one of ancient Mesopotamia's most remarkable rulers. His reign of almost 50 years saw the Ur-Threy state reach its administrative zenith. Shulgi was not just a conqueror, but an organizer, a systematizer who created a bureaucratic apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. Under his rule, the empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an official appointed by and responsible to the king. These governors collected taxes, maintained order, organized labor for public works, and reported regularly to Urim, the administrative archives from this period. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from sites like Dreum, Umma, and Pusrish Dagan reveal a system of meticulous record-keeping that is almost modern in its bureaucratic thoroughness. Every sheep in the royal herds was counted, every worker's rations recorded, every field's yield calculated. Messengers travelled constantly between the capital and the provinces, carrying instructions out and reports back. The speed and efficiency of communication was remarkable for an ancient state. Shulgi reformed the calendar, standardizing it across the empire so that dates were consistent rather than varying by city as they had before. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring that commerce could be conducted fairly across the realm. He reformed the taxation system, establishing rates based on careful assessment of productive capacity. These measures made the empire more efficient and more profitable, generating the wealth needed to support the administrative apparatus and fund construction projects. Like Naram-Sin before him, Shulgi claimed divinity. He had himself deified during his lifetime, worshipped in temples, invoked in oaths. But Shulgi's deification seems to have been less controversial than Naram-Sin's, perhaps because he combined it with traditional piety. He presented himself as the god's faithful servant, even while claiming to be himself divine, a paradox that Mesopotamian theology apparently accommodated. Shulgi was also a patron of literature and the arts. He claimed personal accomplishments in literacy, mathematics, and music. Numerous hymns survive that praise him in extravagant terms, describing his wisdom, his strength, his beauty, his justice. Some of these hymns may have been composed by the king himself, though this is debated. Whether or not he wrote them, they reflect the cultural sophistication of his reign, a time when Sumerian literature flourished. The Ur-Athur period saw the composition or compilation of many of the Sumerian literary works that survive today. The hymns to gods and kings, the myths and legends, the wisdom literature. Much of what we know as Sumerian literature reached its final form during this century. Scribal schools trained new generations in the classic texts, creating a literary canon that would influence all subsequent Mesopotamian cultures. Economically, the empire was managed through a system that modern scholars call temple economy or redistributive economy. While private property and private commerce existed, a large portion of the economy was controlled by temple and palace institutions. Agricultural land belonging to these institutions was worked by dependent laborers who received rations in exchange for their work. The harvest was collected in institutional storehouses and then redistributed as rations to workers, as offerings to gods, as trade goods, or as taxes to the central government. This system required enormous administrative effort, but was apparently effective. The empire was prosperous, trade flourished, the cities were rebuilt and beautified, population grew, the irrigation systems were maintained and expanded. For nearly a century, the Ur-3 state provided stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing to southern Mesopotamia. But like all empires, Ur-3 contained the seeds of its own decline. The very administrative efficiency that made it successful also made it rigid. The extensive bureaucracy was expensive to maintain. The dependent labor system, while productive, created social tensions and may have reduced innovation. The empire's wealth and power attracted enemies on all frontiers, and crucially, the system depended on the personal authority and ability of strong kings. When weak kings succeeded, the system could not maintain itself. Shulgi's successors, Ammar-Sin, Shu-Sin, and Ibi-Sin, ruled successively shorter and less successful reigns. Ammar-Sin ruled 9 years, Shu-Sin 9 years, and Ibi-Sin 24 years, but with declining effective control. The empire faced increasing pressure from Amorite peoples to the west, nomadic or semi-nomadic groups who infiltrated the empire, sometimes peacefully as migrants, sometimes as raiders. The eastern frontier saw conflict with Elam, the mountainous kingdom that would eventually deliver the killing blow to Ur III. There is evidence of economic problems during the later years of the dynasty. Texts mention disruptions to the regular flow of goods and workers. Provincial officials complained about lack of support from the center. The elaborate bureaucratic machinery seemed to be breaking down. Whether this was cause or effect of the empire's decline is debatable, but clearly the system was under stress. The final crisis came from multiple directions. Amorites overran much of the western part of the empire. Independent kingdoms arose in the north as central authority weakened. And then, around 2004 BCE, an Elamite army invaded from the east, besieged Ur, captured the city, and carried away the last king, Ibbi-Sin, as a prisoner. The fall of Ur was mourned in some of the most moving literature to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. The lament for Ur describes the destruction in vivid, painful detail. The goddess Ningal pleads with the gods to spare her city but is overruled. The city is sacked, its people killed or enslaved, its temples destroyed. The lament ends with a note of hope that perhaps the gods will allow the city to be rebuilt. But the age of Ur's dominance was over. The fall of Ur III marked the end of Sumerian political independence forever. Never again would a Sumerian dynasty rule over Mesopotamia. The subsequent history of the region would be dominated by Semitic-speaking peoples, the Amorites, who established numerous kingdoms, including Babylon, which would eventually dominate the region. But while Sumerian political power ended, Sumerian cultural influence would persist for millennia. Legacy and transformation. The collapse of Ur III did not mean the disappearance of Sumerian civilization, but rather its transformation and absorption into the broader Mesopotamian cultural continuum. The Amorite dynasties that dominated the subsequent period, particularly the Old Babylonian period from roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, adopted and adapted Sumerian culture. They worshipped Sumerian gods under Semitic names. They preserved and copied Sumerian literature. They used Sumerian as a learned language, much as Latin would be used in medieval Europe, long after it had ceased to be anyone's native tongue. The Sumerian language, which had been in decline even during the Ur III period, as Akkadian became increasingly dominant, gradually died out as a spoken language. By around 1800 BCE, it seems there were no more native speakers. But Sumerian continued to be taught in scribal schools, used for religious and literary purposes, studied by scholars. Sumerian texts were copied and recopied, translated into Akkadian, commented upon by generations of scribes. In this way, Sumerian culture was preserved and transmitted to successor civilizations. The cultural debt that later Mesopotamian civilizations owed to Sumer was enormous. The cuneiform writing system, invented by the Sumerians, was adapted to write Akkadian and numerous other languages. It would be used for another 3,000 years, finally dying out only in the 1st century CE. The literary traditions established by the Sumerians, their myths and epics, were preserved and expanded by later cultures. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which has Sumerian roots, was recomposed in Akkadian and became the greatest literary work of ancient Mesopotamia, copied and read across the Near East. Religious ideas and practices flowed from Sumer to later cultures. The Babylonians worshipped essentially the same gods as the Sumerians, under different names. Inanna became Ishtar, Enlil became Elil, but their attributes and myths remained largely unchanged. The ziggurat tradition continued, with Babylon building its famous ziggurat, the Etemenanki, which may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Temple rituals, priestly hierarchies, religious festivals, all maintained fundamental continuity with Sumerian precedents. Legal traditions likewise showed continuity. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous Babylonian law code from around 1750 BCE, drew heavily on earlier Sumerian codes. Many of its provisions are almost identical to those in the earlier codes of Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar. The principle that law should be written down, made public, and applied consistently This Sumerian innovation became a defining characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization. Mathematical and scientific knowledge accumulated by the Sumerians was preserved and expanded. The sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, which the Sumerians developed for unknown reasons, was adopted by all subsequent Mesopotamian cultures. It gave us our 60-second minute, our 60-minute hour, our 360-degree circle, Sumerian astronomical observations, their mathematical tables, their medical knowledge, all were incorporated into later Babylonian and Assyrian learning. The influence extended beyond Mesopotamia itself. The Hittites in Anatolia, the peoples of Syria and the Levant, even the Egyptians, all had contact with Mesopotamian civilization and borrowed from it. Through these contacts, Sumerian innovations spread across the ancient Near East. When the Greeks encountered Mesopotamian culture, they too absorbed influences. Babylonian astronomy influenced Greek astronomical thought. Mesopotamian mathematical concepts found their way into Greek mathematics. Some scholars argue that even Greek philosophical traditions show traces of earlier Mesopotamian wisdom literature. The rediscovery of Sumer by modern archaeology is itself a fascinating story. For millennia, the Sumerian civilization was forgotten. The ruins of their cities lay buried beneath the Iraqi desert. The Bible mentioned Babylon and Assyria, but made no clear reference to the Sumerians. Classical Greek and Roman authors knew of Mesopotamian civilizations, but did not distinguish the earlier Sumerian period from later eras. When European scholars began to explore the ancient Near East in the 19th century, they initially knew nothing of Sumer. The decipherment of cuneiform was a crucial breakthrough. In the mid-19th century, scholars succeeded in reading Akkadian cuneiform, unlocking a vast literature. But some texts resisted translation. They were written in cuneiform but made no sense as Akkadian. Eventually, scholars realized they were dealing with a different language, which they called Sumerian. This discovery opened up an entirely new chapter of human history, revealing a civilization that predated even the Babylonians and Assyrians. Excavations at Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and other sites gradually revealed the physical remains of Sumerian civilization. The Great Ziggurat of Ur was excavated in the 1920s and 1930s by Leonard Woolley, who also discovered the famous royal tombs of Ur with their spectacular grave goods. The city of Uruk yielded evidence of the earliest writing. Nippur provided vast archives of Sumerian literary texts. Each excavation added to our understanding, though much remains unknown and probably always will. The study of Sumerian continues today. New tablets are still being published and translated. Archaeological excavations, though hampered by the political situation in Iraq, continue to reveal new sites and new information. Our understanding of Sumerian grammar, which remains incomplete, is gradually improving. Digital humanities projects are creating comprehensive databases of Sumerian texts, making them accessible to scholars worldwide. What can we learn from Sumer? What does this ancient civilization teach us about human nature, about the origins of complex society, about the possibilities and limits of cultural achievement? These are large questions with no simple answers, but some observations seem warranted. First, Sumer demonstrates that civilization is not a single thing, but a bundle of innovations that can be combined in various ways. Cities, writing, complex social hierarchies, monumental architecture, specialized labor, organized religion, all these emerged in Sumer in close connection with each other. But the causal relationships are not always clear. Did cities require writing, or writing require cities? Did religion drive social hierarchy, or did emerging elites use religion to justify their position? Different scholars answer these questions differently, but what is clear is that civilization is a complex adaptive system that emerges from multiple interacting factors. Second, Sumer shows us that early civilizations were not primitive or simple. The Sumerians were sophisticated people with complex thoughts, deep emotions, refined aesthetic sensibilities, and profound questions about existence. When we read their literature, we encounter minds that seem familiar despite the vast gulf of time. They worried about death, grieved for lost friends, questioned the justice of the gods, took pride in their accomplishments, feared their failures. They were, in short, fully human in every way that matters. Third, the environmental constraints that shaped Sumerian civilization remind us of the importance of geography and climate in human history. The challenges of the Mesopotamian environment, the capricious rivers, the lack of natural resources, the vulnerability to drought and flood, all these shaped Sumerian society and its innovations. The irrigation systems, the emphasis on cooperation and central coordination, the development of trade networks to obtain needed materials, all were responses to environmental challenges. In our own era of climate change and environmental stress, the Sumerian experience offers both warnings and possible lessons. Finally, Sumer reminds us of the fragility of human achievement. This great civilization, which created writing and cities, which built magnificent temples and produced sublime literature, which seemed so powerful and permanent to its inhabitants, eventually fell. It was conquered, absorbed, transformed, until finally even the language itself was forgotten. The ziggurats crumbled, the cities were buried, the tablets were scattered or destroyed. Only through archaeology and modern scholarship has this lost world been partially recovered. Yet, in another sense, Sumer never truly died. Its achievements were too fundamental, too embedded in subsequent cultures, to be entirely lost. Every time you check your watch and see 60 minutes to the hour, you are using a Sumerian innovation. Every time you read a contract or consult a law, you are participating in a tradition the Sumerians pioneered. The very idea of civilization, of cities and writing and organized society, owes its first full expression to Sumer. In that sense, we are all heirs of the Sumerians, whether we know it or not. Daily life in the world's first civilization, having explored the grand sweep of Sumerian history, the political changes and cultural achievements, let us now descend from the level of kings and gods to examine the everyday lives of ordinary Sumerians. How did common people live in the world's first civilization? What did they eat, wear, believe? How did they spend their days? What were their hopes and fears? The vast majority of Sumerians were farmers, as was true of nearly all pre-industrial societies. Agriculture was the foundation of everything else, producing the surplus food that fed the city dwellers, the craftsmen, priests, scribes, soldiers, and administrators who made civilization possible. Sumerian farmers grew primarily barley, which thrived in the Mesopotamian climate better than wheat. They also cultivated dates, which were a major source of sugar and nutrition, onions, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, and various other vegetables and legumes. The agricultural calendar dominated the rhythm of life. Fields had to be ploughed, seeded, irrigated, weeded, and harvested according to the seasons. The Sumerian year began with the spring barley harvest, a time of intense labor but also of celebration. The harvest festival was one of the most important religious observances, when the first fruits were offered to the gods in thanksgiving. After the harvest came the hot summer months when little agricultural work was possible, a time for maintaining irrigation canals and preparing for the next planting season in autumn. Irrigation was central to Sumerian agriculture. The climate was too dry for reliable rain-fed farming, so water had to be channeled from the rivers through an elaborate system of canals, dikes, and ditches. Maintaining this system required constant collective effort. Canals had to be dredged regularly to prevent them from silting up. Dikes had to be reinforced. Water rights had to be managed to ensure fair distribution. This need for cooperation in water management was one of the factors that drove the development of complex social organization and central authority. Farmers used simple but effective tools. The plough, one of the Sumerians' most important inventions, was essentially a wooden frame with a bronze or later iron blade that cut through the soil. It was pulled by oxen, animals that were valuable property requiring significant investment to purchase and maintain. Wealthy farmers might own their own ox teams, but many small farmers had to share or rent oxen for ploughing season. Sickles made of fired clay set with flint blades were used to harvest grain. Threshing was done by having animals walk over the cut grain to separate the kernels from the chaff. The harvest was rarely consumed directly by the farming family. Most farmers worked land belonging to temples or wealthy landowners. They were required to deliver a portion of their harvest, often a substantial majority, as rent or taxes. What remained had to feed the family for the entire year and provide seed for the next planting. In good years, there might be a small surplus to sell or trade. In bad years, when harvests failed or were damaged by flood or drought, farmers might have to borrow grain or silver, falling into debt that could eventually force them to sell themselves or their children into slavery. City dwellers had more varied occupations. Craftsmen specialized in particular trades passed down through families. There were potters who shaped clay vessels on fast-spinning wheels, their products ranging from simple cooking pots to elaborately decorated jars and bowls. Weavers created textiles from wool, spinning thread and weaving it into cloth on both horizontal and vertical looms. The textile industry was particularly important, employing large numbers of workers, many of them women, in temple and palace workshops. Sumerian textiles were exported widely and were renowned for their quality. Metal workers cast copper and bronze into tools, weapons, vessels, and jewelry. This was skilled work requiring knowledge of alloying, casting techniques, and finishing methods. The finest metalwork went into luxury items for the elite. Jewelry set with precious stones, elaborate vessels for temple rituals, weapons with decorated hilts. But metal was also used for practical items. Bronze axes and adzes for carpentry, sickles for harvesting, needles for sewing. Merchants conducted trade both locally and over long distances. Local markets operated in the cities where farmers sold produce, craftsmen sold their wares, and people bartered or used silver as a medium of exchange. Long-distance trade was more complex and risky. Merchants organized caravans or ships to transport goods to distant regions, trading Mesopotamian textiles and grain for timber, stone, metal ore, and luxury goods. Some merchants operated independently, but many were employed by temples or palaces, managing institutional resources and keeping careful accounts of all transactions. Scribes formed an educated elite. We have discussed their training and importance, but their daily work deserves mention. Most scribes were employed as administrators, recording transactions, keeping inventories, writing contracts and legal documents. They worked in temple and palace offices, sitting cross-legged on the floor or on low stools, using reed styluses to press cuneiform signs into soft clay tablets. The tablets were then dried in the sun or fired in kilns to preserve them permanently. Some scribes specialized in literary composition or copying, preserving and transmitting the cultural heritage. Priests were responsible for maintaining the temples and performing the rituals that kept the gods satisfied. This was not a small job. The daily care of the god's statue, the preparation of offerings, the performance of prayers and hymns, the maintenance of the temple building and grounds, all required a substantial staff. Large temples might employ hundreds of people, priests of various ranks, musicians, singers, craftsmen, guards, cleaners, and administrators. The high priest of a major temple was one of the most powerful people in the city, controlling vast resources and wielding significant political influence. Women's roles varied significantly depending on social class. Elite women could own property, conduct business, and hold important positions, especially as priestesses. The most prestigious role was that of the high priestess, like Enheduanna, who combined religious authority with political influence. Some priestesses lived in temple complexes devoted to the god's service. Others might be Naditu priestesses who lived in cloisters, managing their own property and conducting business, but not marrying or bearing children. Common women's lives centered on the household. They managed the home, prepared food, raised children, and often contributed to family income through spinning and weaving. This work was economically important, even if it was done in the home rather than in a workshop. Women could also work in temple and palace workshops as weavers, and some worked as tavern keepers or traders. Legally, women could own property, though this right was more restricted than for men. They could inherit from their fathers and sometimes from their husbands. They could testify in court, though their testimony might carry less weight than a man's. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement negotiated between families. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family, while the bride brought a dowry of goods and property into the marriage. Marriage contracts were written and witnessed, specifying the arrangements and the conditions under which divorce might occur. Polygamy was legal, and wealthy men might have multiple wives, though most people were monogamous simply because they could not afford multiple wives. Children were valued, especially sons who would carry on the family name and care for parents in old age. But childhood mortality was high, and many children did not survive their first few years. Those who did survive began learning their future roles early. Boys might follow their father's trades, learning by apprenticeship. Elite boys might attend scribal school if their families could afford it. Girls learned household management, spinning, and weaving from their mothers. Children of slaves were generally born into slavery, though freedom could sometimes be purchased or granted. The Sumerian diet was based on grains, primarily barley made into bread or porridge. Beer was a staple beverage, drunk by all classes including children, though the quality varied. Elite beer was brewed carefully and filtered. Common beer was thicker and less refined. Dates provided sweetness. Vegetables like onions and garlic were important. Fish from the rivers and canals was a common protein source. Meat was eaten less frequently, mainly on festival occasions or by the wealthy. Sheep, goats, and cattle were too valuable to slaughter regularly for food, being more useful for wool, milk, and labor. Food preparation was labor-intensive. Grain had to be ground into flour using a stone quern, a task that occupied hours of work for women. Bread was baked in dome-shaped ovens. Cooking was done over fire in ceramic pots. Preservation was challenging in the hot climate. Grains could be stored if kept dry. Dates dried naturally and kept well. Fish might be dried or salted, but fresh food spoiled quickly, so most food had to be prepared and consumed soon after it was obtained. Clothing was made primarily from wool, with linen used by the wealthy. The basic garment for both men and women was a wrapped skirt or dress, leaving the upper body bare or covered with a separate shawl. Over time, more complex wrapped and draped garments developed. Clothing reflected status. The wealthy wore finely woven cloth, sometimes with decorative fringes or embroidery. The poor wore coarse cloth. Priests wore specific ritual garments appropriate to their rank and function. Soldiers wore leather or felt armor, sometimes reinforced with bronze scales. Personal appearance mattered. Both men and women wore jewelry when they could afford it. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, rings. Men typically wore beards, groomed and sometimes elaborately curled. Women wore their hair long, sometimes in complex braided styles. Cosmetics were used by both sexes among the elite. Kohl to line the eyes, oils and perfumes for the skin and hair. These items were luxury goods, but they were considered important markers of civilization. The Sumerians distinguished themselves from the peoples they considered barbarians partly through standards of grooming and dress. Housing varied by class, but followed similar basic patterns. The typical house was built of mud brick, with walls thick enough to provide insulation from heat. Rooms were arranged around a central courtyard which provided light, air, and a space for household activities. The courtyard might contain an oven for baking and a well or cistern for water. Roofs were flat, made of wooden beams covered with reeds and sealed with mud. They provided additional living space, especially in hot weather when families might sleep on the roof to catch any breeze. Wealthy homes were larger, with more rooms, decorated with niches and painted walls. They might have a reception room for guests, separate women's quarters, storage rooms, and rooms for slaves or servants. The very wealthy might have two-story houses, with living quarters on the second floor and storage or shops on the ground floor. Some elite homes have been excavated with elaborate bathrooms featuring drains and even early forms of toilets connected to sewage systems. Entertainment and leisure activities, for those who had time for them, included music, games, and storytelling. Music was important in Sumerian culture, both in religious ceremonies and in secular contexts. Instruments included lyres, harps, drums, and reed pipes. Professional musicians entertained at festivals and in wealthy households. Some texts describe singing competitions and musical performances. Board games were popular. The royal game of discovered in the royal cemetery, is one of the earliest known board games. It was played on a beautifully decorated board with elaborate game pieces, suggesting it was a valued pastime among the elite. Simpler games using stones or clay pieces were probably played by common people as well. Dice made from bone or ceramic have been found, suggesting gambling was also popular. Storytelling was a central form of entertainment. In a world where most people could not read, oral tradition was how culture was transmitted. Professional storytellers might recite myths and epics in public settings. Families would tell stories in the evenings. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, they educated children about cultural values, they explained natural phenomena, and they connected people to their shared heritage. Religious observance permeated daily life. Each morning, a householder might say prayers at a household shrine, making small offerings to protective deities. Before eating, one might recite blessings. During the day, one might visit a temple to make an offering or seek a blessing. Major religious festivals punctuated the year, occasions when normal work ceased, and the entire community participated in processions, feasts, and ritual observances. These festivals were times of both religious devotion and social celebration. The New Year festival was particularly important, a time when the order of the cosmos was ritually renewed, when the king's legitimacy was confirmed through elaborate ceremonies, when debts might be forgiven and social tensions released. During such festivals, temples distributed food and beer to the people. There was music, dancing, and celebration. For ordinary people working hard throughout the year, these festivals were highlights, times of abundance, joy, and community solidarity. Death and burial practices reveal much about Sumerian beliefs and values. When someone died, the body was typically buried beneath the floor of the house or in a cemetery outside the city walls. The deceased was buried with grave goods, pottery vessels containing food and drink for the journey to the afterlife, personal items like jewelry or tools, cylinder seals, sometimes weapons. The quantity and quality of grave goods varied with the person's wealth and status. The royal tombs of dating to the early dynastic period around 2600 BCE, reveal the most elaborate burial practices. These tombs contained extraordinary treasures: gold and lapis lazuli jewelry, musical instruments, weapons, and vessels. Most disturbingly, they also contained the bodies of attendants, apparently killed to accompany their masters into death. Whether these attendants went willingly, perhaps drugged or drunk, or were forced, we cannot know. But their presence indicates beliefs about the afterlife that required a king to be served even in death. For common people, burial was simpler but still important. The grave had to be properly prepared, the body correctly positioned, appropriate offerings made. Funerary rituals ensured the deceased's safe passage to the underworld and their contentment there. Neglecting these duties could result in the dead becoming restless ghosts that troubled the living. Families maintained the memory of their ancestors through regular offerings and invocations, ensuring that the dead remained properly supplied and remembered. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, probably around 30 to 35 years on average. though these averages are skewed by high infant and child mortality. Those who survived childhood might live into their 50s or even 60s. Disease was common and often fatal. Injuries from accidents or violence could quickly become infected and deadly. Childbirth was dangerous for women. Medical care existed, with physicians who understood some effective treatments, but their knowledge was limited and mixed with magical practices. Incantations and amulets were prescribed alongside herbal remedies and surgical procedures. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Sumerians valued life intensely. Their literature expresses a profound appreciation for sensory pleasures, the taste of food and beer, the embrace of a lover, the sound of music, the satisfaction of a job well done. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in counseling its hero to abandon his quest for immortality, tells him to embrace life's pleasures. Eat good food, wear fine clothes, love your wife, cherish your children, enjoy each day. This advice, given 4,000 years ago, remains wisdom for any age. The daily life of ancient Sumerians, for all its differences from our own, reveals people who were fundamentally like us. They loved and feared, hoped and despaired, worked and rested, celebrated and mourned. They took pride in their accomplishments and worried about their failures. They cared for their families, served their gods, and tried to live good lives according to their understanding. Their world is gone, but their humanity endures in the records they left behind. Conclusion and reflection as we reach the end of this long journey through the world's oldest known civilization. Let us pause to reflect on what we have seen. We have watched cities rise from village clusters, seen writing transform from simple accounting marks into sublime literature, observed the birth of law and empire, witnessed the flowering of art and architecture that still astonishes us today. We have walked through the streets of ancient Uruk, stood in the shadow of ziggurats, read the words of kings and poets preserved on clay for millennia. We have met the Sumerians not as abstract figures from a distant past, but as real people living complex lives in a civilization they created from nothing. The question of what makes Sumer the oldest civilization returns us to where we began. Other settlements were older. Other communities developed agriculture, pottery, and trade before the Sumerians. But Sumer was the first place where all the elements of civilization came together in a recognizable form. Cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, monumental architecture expressing collective ambition, writing systems preserving thought and speech across time, complex social hierarchies organizing specialized labor, systematic law attempting to establish justice, and rich cultural production exploring the deepest questions of human existence. This combination, this synthesis, appeared first in Sumer. What enabled this breakthrough? The question has occupied scholars for generations and admits no simple answer. Geography played a role. The Mesopotamian environment, challenging but not impossible, required cooperation and innovation. The rivers provided water but demanded management. The flat alluvial plain allowed large-scale irrigation but lacked natural defenses, encouraging the development of walls and organized military forces. The absence of many natural resources necessitated trade, creating connections with distant regions and exposing Sumerians to new ideas and technologies. Population concentration was crucial. When thousands of people live in close proximity, specialization becomes possible and necessary. Not everyone needs to grow food when farmers can produce surplus. Craftsmen can develop skills, traders can facilitate exchange, administrators can coordinate activities, priests can maintain rituals. Each specialization builds on others, creating positive feedback loops that generate increasing complexity. The city, that distinctive Sumerian innovation, was the crucible in which civilization was forged, but geography and demography alone cannot explain. Sumer, other regions had rivers and dense populations, but did not independently develop complex civilization. Something more was needed, a cultural willingness to innovate, to experiment with new forms of social organization, to develop abstract systems like writing and mathematics, to invest enormous collective resources in projects like irrigation systems and ziggurats. This cultural creativity, this inventiveness, is perhaps the most mysterious and impressive aspect of the Sumerian achievement. The Sumerians were not simply reacting to environmental pressures. They were actively creating new possibilities, imagining forms of organization and expression that had never existed before. When they invented writing, they were not just solving an accounting problem, but opening up entirely new modes of human consciousness. When they built the first cities, they were not just concentrating population, but creating new forms of social life. When they composed the first literature, they were not just telling stories, but exploring what it means to be human in ways that still resonate today. The legacy of Sumer extends across thousands of years to touch our own time. We have mentioned specific technical and cultural inheritances: the 60-minute hour, the concept of written law, the earliest literature, the urban planning and monumental architecture that influenced all subsequent civilizations. But the deeper legacy is the very idea of civilization itself. Sumer demonstrated that humans could create complex, sophisticated societies, that we could transcend the limitations of village life to build something greater. This demonstration inspired and enabled all the civilizations that followed. Yet the Sumerian story also contains warnings. We have seen how environmental stress contributed to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, how drought and climate change undermined even sophisticated civilizations. We have watched how inequality and exploitation, despite reform efforts like those of Uruk-agina, were endemic to Sumerian society, creating social tensions that weakened the social fabric. We have observed how imperial ambition and constant warfare drained resources and created instability. These patterns, familiar from more recent history, remind us that civilization's challenges are perennial, that human societies have always struggled with questions of justice, sustainability, and peace. The fall of Ur and the end of Sumerian political independence remind us that even great civilizations are impermanent. The Sumerians themselves knew this. Their literature is full of lamentations for destroyed cities, meditations on the transience of power and glory. The Epic of Gilgamesh reaches its climax when the hero realizes that immortality is impossible, that human achievement, however great, is ultimately fleeting. This awareness of impermanence, far from leading to despair, gave Sumerian culture a profound appreciation for the present moment, for the value of what can be created, even if it cannot last forever. Modern archaeology has given us a privilege the Sumerians themselves did not have: the ability to see their civilization from the outside, to trace its arc from beginning to end, to appreciate both its achievements and its ultimate transformation into something else. This perspective is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it reveals how even the greatest human accomplishments are contingent and temporary. Inspiring because it shows what humans can achieve when they work together, when they apply intelligence and creativity to solving problems, when they dare to imagine new possibilities. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through ancient Sumer one last time. You stand at the base of the great ziggurat of Ur, its mud brick walls rising above you in 3 massive stages, its staircases climbing toward the temple at its summit. The sun is setting over the Mesopotamian plain, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The city is alive around you. Workers returning from the fields, craftsmen closing their shops, priests preparing the evening ritual for the moon god Nana. You hear the sound of a lyre played in a nearby courtyard, someone singing an ancient hymn in a language that will one day be forgotten and then, miraculously, remembered again. You smell bread baking in clay ovens, the sharp scent of beer brewing in large jars, the incense that drifts from the temple complex. You see children playing in the streets, merchants securing their goods for the night, a scribe hurrying past with tablets tucked under his arm, a priest in ritual garments making his way toward the ziggurat. This is the world's first civilization, the place where humanity first became urban, literate, organized into complex societies. These are the people who invented writing, who built cities, who created literature that speaks across 4,000 years to touch us still. They are long gone, their language silent, their cities buried, their names forgotten by all but scholars. But their legacy endures. In every book we read, every law we obey, every city we build, every question we ask about justice and meaning and the good life, we are the inheritors of Sumer. The moon rises over the ruins tonight, as it has risen for millennia, watching over the buried cities and scattered tablets. The desert wind whispers through the remains of the great ziggurat. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though their courses have changed, still watering the land where civilization first began. And we, separated from the Sumerians by vast gulfs of time and culture, nevertheless remain connected to them through our shared humanity, through the questions we both ask, through the civilizations we both build and watch crumble and build again. If you have found this journey through the oldest known civilization compelling, if the story of Sumer has captured your imagination, please consider subscribing for more explorations of history's mysteries and forgotten worlds. Leave a like if you enjoyed this glimpse into the deep past, and tell me in the comments, what aspect of Sumerian civilization fascinated you most? Was it their invention of writing, their magnificent architecture, their profound literature, or something else? And what other ancient civilizations would you like to explore? Until we meet again in the quiet hours between waking and sleeping, may your dreams be vivid with all the lost worlds that once flourished on this ancient earth. May you rest well, knowing that human creativity and achievement, though fleeting, are also eternal in the legacy they leave. The Sumerians are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their story continues in every civilization that followed, including our own. And as you drift into sleep, perhaps you carry with you a small piece of that first civilization, that first great human experiment in living together, building together, creating together something larger than any individual could achieve alone. The night deepens. The stars shine over the Mesopotamian plain as they have shone for thousands of years. And somewhere beneath the sand and ruins, the clay tablets wait patiently, preserving the words of long-dead scribes, the accounts of forgotten merchants, the hymns of ancient priests, the dreams and fears and hopes of the world's first civilization. They wait to be found, to be read, to speak again across the centuries, telling us who we were and perhaps who we might yet become. Sleep well and dream of Sumer.